The strangest thing about a Rockefeller house is never the marble or the money, it's the paperwork. At Kykuit, the clean official plan used for tours, maintenance, and insurance reads like a confession by omission. A whole section of the mansion simply isn't there, not mislabeled, not locked, not even acknowledged. And then, during restoration work meant to preserve history, the wood itself answers back. Panels cut too perfectly, aligned too deliberately, hiding a service door that, on paper, should not exist. Kykuit sits above the Hudson like a controlled horizon, a Gilded Age statement dressed in limestone, clipped hedges, and a calm so curated it feels rehearsed. Visitors remember the terraces, the sculpture gardens, the disciplined grandeur of a family that learned to turn wealth into permanence. But permanence is a performance, and performances require editing. In the early 20th century, when fortunes were defended not only by lawyers and trusts, but by the careful management of what could be seen, an estate like this functioned as both home and vault, a place where the visible rooms told one story and the unseen ones carried the rest. You can smell it when the building is disturbed. Old varnish warming under work lamps, dust rising from cavities that haven't breathed in decades, the dry paper-sweet scent of timber sealed away from modern air. Restoration is supposed to be a moral act, an honest attempt to bring a structure back to what it was. But sometimes, restoration becomes an interrogation, and the house does not appreciate being questioned. The starting point is almost humiliating for any institution that claims stewardship over history. The official floor plan, archived for the practical reasons that govern any great property, from maintenance schedules to insurance liabilities, does not contain an entire wing. That is not an architectural quirk. It is an administrative absence, the kind that requires decisions, signatures, and silence. Plans. Do not lose rooms the way people lose keys. Rooms disappear on paper only when someone wants them to, and during a routine stage of conservation, when craftsmen were stripping back decorative woodwork and resecuring panels that had loosened with time. There it was, a section of wall whose symmetry was too disciplined to be mere ornament. The grain matched too well. The seams were too straight. The panels sat with the smug precision of something designed to be overlooked. When the hidden latch finally yielded, it did not open into romance or theatricality. It opened into discretion. A sealed service door, utilitarian, deliberately uncelebrated, gave onto a short corridor finished in a subdued manner that felt almost calculated, as if whoever commissioned it wanted it to be traveled but never remembered. No grand arch, no decorative flourish, just a passage meant for quiet feet, quiet hands, and quiet purpose. The air beyond it carried that unmistakable chill of long closed spaces, the kind that makes voices drop without anyone asking them to. Even the light behaved differently there, swallowed by angles that were never intended for tour lamps or curious eyes. That is where the first real document enters the story, not as proof of innocence, but as evidence of editing. A site plan dated to the beginning of the 20th century, then revised, re-revised, and updated in later decades, contains a small but devastating anomaly. Room numbers that leap forward as if the house has skipped a heartbeat. A sequence breaks. A set of chambers is renumbered. The mathematics of the mansion doesn't add up, and it's the kind of arithmetic that architects and estate managers notice instantly. When you see gaps like that, you don't think of accidents. You think of intent. It resembles the way names disappear from ledgers when families decide a person must become unmentionable. The revelation is immediate, but only partial. Kykuit did not merely have private areas, as all great houses do. It had areas that were deliberately deregistered, erased in the bureaucratic language that governs what can be insured, cataloged, curated, and publicly discussed. The mansion was edited on paper before it was ever offered to the world as heritage. And once you understand that, the questions harden. If a wing does not exist in the records, then whatever it held was never meant to stand trial in public judgment, not even under the gentler gaze of curators. The Gilded Age understood scandal as a force that could collapse legacies, and the families who survived it learned to build not only with stone and steel, but with procedures, locked inventories, private contractors, servants bound by obligation, and archives that could be cleaned as easily as a stain removed from linen. Newspapers of the era thrived on whispers of sealed rooms and hidden heirs, yet the most damaging stories rarely needed to be printed, they only needed to be feared. A house like this did not simply keep secrets. It managed them, deciding which truths deserved sunlight and which could be kept in controlled darkness. If this case reminds you of another mansion with a sealed corridor, another estate where the blueprints look too perfect to be honest, share it below. These patterns repeat across Golden Age secrets, and sometimes the comment section becomes the only surviving archive. And if you're drawn to the places the elite tried to erase, hidden heirs, forbidden rooms, silent witnesses, and records that don't quite match, then subscribe, because this channel exists to follow the missing lines on the map before they're corrected again. Because the most unsettling part isn't that a door was found, it's that long before the panels were touched, someone decided that the door would not be allowed to exist, at least not on paper. And that means the motive was never architecture, but what the architecture was protecting, waiting in the dark like a sentence history refused to finish. Before a single object is touched, before any dust is lifted from a shelf or any lock is tested, there is the older machinery that has to be understood, the social logic that made a hidden wing not only possible, but almost inevitable. The Gilded Age did not merely reward wealth. It demanded that wealth be translated into respectability, and that respectability be defended like a second fortune. Reputation was an asset as real as rail lines, oil shares, and bank paper. And for dynasties like the Rockefellers, managing property was inseparable from managing narrative. What the public believed about a family's refinement, its taste, its restraint, its philanthropy, could determine how newspapers framed a strike, how politicians spoke in private, how rivals negotiated, and how scandal would be priced if it ever escaped containment. A mansion in that world was never just a residence. It was a dual mechanism, one side designed to be seen, the other designed to function. The visible side performed culture. The hidden side protected process. And the line between those two halves was not always a grand staircase or a velvet rope. Often it was a narrow door disguised by paneling, an unremarkable corridor, a change in the sound of the floorboards beneath a servant's foot. In the public rooms, everything was orchestration. Light angled to flatter portraits, polished brass that caught the eye at exactly the right height, tapestries and carved mantels that implied old European lineage, even when the money behind them was new. The air smelled of beeswax, cigar smoke carefully confined, and flowers replaced so regularly they never had the chance to wilt into honesty. Those were the spaces of representation, the drawing rooms where the family's good works could be discussed without ever naming the costs. The galleries arranged to suggest intellectual seriousness, the library that felt public without actually being public, curated for the kinds of visitors who mattered. In such rooms, a dynasty could appear almost inevitable, civilized, benevolent, above the mess of industry. If a guest remembered anything upon leaving, it was supposed to be refinement. But beyond that, choreography lived the operational anatomy of the house, and operational spaces have a different aesthetic. They favor silence over spectacle, efficiency over beauty, control over comfort, service corridors that allowed staff to move without being seen, offices where papers were handled with the same discretion as jewels, strong rooms, literal and bureaucratic, where inventories, keys, and records could be managed away from prying eyes, bedrooms placed not for comfort but for usefulness, discreet chambers whose very existence depended on not being spoken of in the wrong tone, to the wrong person, within the wrong hearing distance. In those spaces, the mansion stopped being a symbol and became what it had always been beneath its grandeur, an engine. And engines require rules. That is why the most revealing traces are often not dramatic discoveries but administrative ones. Documents meant to coordinate human labor, never meant to satisfy curiosity. A staff manual, a house rules ledger, the kind of internal book that lists who opens which doors at which hours, who is permitted to linger, who is never to be alone in certain sections, which lamps are to remain unlit, which staircases are not for guests even when no guests are present. It's in such mundane pages that the mansion's honest geography begins to leak out. A notation about a private wing schedule, a reference to keys that correspond to no publicly acknowledged rooms, a rotation that does not match the areas visitors can tour, as if the building were living two lives on two separate calendars. There is something chilling about bureaucracy when it is used as camouflage. It does not shout, it normalizes. It turns concealment into routine. A line in a ledger can hide an entire corridor more effectively than stone can, because the line becomes habit, and habit becomes unquestioned law. If a staff member saw a door that wasn't there, they were trained not to see it, not by threat alone, but by repetition. Don't ask, don't look, don't record. Some households enforced it with strict hierarchy and fear of dismissal. Others enforced it with something colder, the quiet knowledge that loyalty would be rewarded and curiosity would ruin you. Either way, the effect was the same. The public would encounter refinement. While the daily survival of the dynasty depended on spaces where the press could not enter, philanthropy could not sanitize, and polite discourse could not reach. This is where the moral consequence settles in. We like to imagine Gilded Age mansions as museums of taste, as stages for dinners and charitable announcements. But they were also fortresses for continuity. A family that could control architecture could also control who had access to information, who could be believed, and which versions of events would become official. The mansion could absorb contradictions the way thick walls absorb sound. It could host generosity in one wing and ruthless calculation in another, without the two ever touching. And because the visible half was so convincing, the invisible half rarely needed defending. The world saw what it was meant to see, and the rest stayed safely unregistered. You have to ask yourself, standing at the threshold of such a discovery, what courage actually means here. Would you have the nerve to enter an archive that was designed to prove respectability, not to record the whole truth, knowing that its neatness might be the most suspicious thing about it? Because that is the dilemma these houses leave behind. The evidence is rarely missing. It is simply sorted into the places you were never intended to visit. And if this division was structural, if representation and operation were built into the blueprint of power, then the hidden wing at Kykuit wasn't an improvisation, a later accident, or a harmless architectural indulgence. It was a component, a deliberate chamber in the machinery of a dark legacy, the kind of feature a dynasty installs when it plans not just to live, but to endure, no matter what must be kept out of sight. The corridor behind that sealed service door begins to feel less like a passage and more like a policy, leading toward rooms that were never meant to be part of history at all, except as a gap in the numbering that no one was supposed to notice. Once you've accepted that a mansion can be edited on paper, the investigation stops being romantic and becomes procedural. The corridor behind the sealed door is a physical fact, but in the world that built Kykuit, physical facts were always meant to be accompanied by paperwork, bills, requisitions, insurance riders, maintenance logs, contractor schedules. That's how great estates survive, not through memory, but through systems, and systems leave trails. The question is whether the trail was erased or simply written in a language designed not to reveal anything. The first real documentary scent doesn't come from a dramatic letter or a diary confession. It comes from the kind of record no one reads unless they are looking for fraud. A construction or maintenance register with a line item that says almost nothing. Improvements, repairs, interior work. The phrasing is so bland it feels like a shrug, and that is precisely the point. In estate accounting, especially in the late Gilded Age and into the early 20th century, silence was often achieved not by destroying documents, but by aggregating them. Costs rolled up into packages, invoices grouped under a single rubric, payments split into harmless segments so that no one line looked like a story. A ledger can hide more effectively than a locked room if the ledger is structured to prevent questions from forming. This is how it works in practice, and it's almost too plausible to be satisfying. A contractor submits a statement with multiple tasks bundled together: plastering, carpentry, hardware, electrical fittings, various adjustments. The estate office pays it as a single approved amount. A procurement list is attached, but only as supporting material, not as a narrative. Quantities, part numbers, delivery dates. No mention of a wing, no mention of a corridor, no mention of rooms that officially do not exist. Just money moving in the careful, muffled way money moves. When it is supervised by people who understand that specificity is dangerous. In the Rockefeller universe, this kind of blandness was not sloppy, it was disciplined. The more public the family's name became, tied to philanthropy, to institutions, to the nation's idea of progress, the more careful the internal machinery had to be. Estates employed managers, clerks, and attorneys, in fact, precisely so that the owners did not need to sign every operational truth with their own hands. And when AI decision carried risk, reputational, legal, political, the buffer layers thickened. Signatures belonged to procurators. Approvals came from offices, not dining rooms. The dynasty remained a symbol, while the estate remained an organism, doing what organisms do, protecting itself. The partial revelation arrives not as a confession, but as a mismatch between the official story and the technical mathematics of materials. In a period where the public-facing narrative claims nothing was expanded, A2As requisition appears for quantities that don't belong to routine repairs. Not a handful of hinges, dozens. Not a couple of lock sets, enough to secure multiple interior doors. A run of trim and molding measured in lengths that imply repeated doorways, repeated frames, repeated thresholds. Luminaires ordered in a coherent set, as if outfitting a suite rather than replacing a single broken fixture. Even the mundane details begin to look like fingerprints. The number of escutcheons, the specific style of knobs, the count of window latches. Individually, they are nothing. Together, they suggest rooms. It is the kind of evidence that feels almost insulting in its restraint. Whoever wrote the ledger knew that future eyes might pass over it, because most eyes do. A phrase like improvements is a blanket thrown over a shape in the dark. But once you know what to measure, the blanket doesn't hide the outline. A house cannot be fitted with hardware and lighting in secret without leaving a shadow in. Procurement. And when that shadow appears in a year where the official records insist the building remained unchanged, you are forced to consider an uncomfortable category: undocumented construction records, not missing records, but records engineered to be non-descriptive. Estate routines make this easier than outsiders imagine. A large property runs on cycles, annual budgets, periodic refurbishments, upgrades disguised as maintenance. Work can be scheduled when the family is away. Materials can be delivered under the name of a general supplier rather than a specific contractor. Labor can be hired through intermediaries. And because the estate is a private entity, not a public institution, the detail level of record keeping is a choice, not a requirement. Especially when the goal is to ensure that nothing in the paper trail invites a tax assessor, an insurance auditor, or a curious journalist to ask, "What exactly did you build?" That is where the consequence sharpens from atmosphere into law. A renovation that doesn't exist in formal description often exists for a reason. Avoid inventory, avoid taxation, avoid proof. Avoid creating a map that could later be subpoenaed, disputed, or used as a weapon in a succession fight. In a world of trusts and heirs, where the difference between legitimate and inconvenient could determine who inherited, and where scandal could move markets as easily as it could ruin dinner invitations, ambiguity was not laziness. It was strategy. If the wing was not described, it could not be easily counted. If it could not be counted, it could not be easily claimed. And if it could not be easily claimed, it could remain what it was intended to be, a controlled space beyond public accounting. This is the moment when the investigation begins to tilt, because the paper has shown its hand. The documents are not absent, they are evasive. They speak, but only in the softest possible terms, as if language itself had been placed under house rules. And if the paperwork has been trained to say nothing, then the only honest witness left is the structure, what the wood, the stone, and the hardware still remember. So the search has to move away from what the ledgers refuse to describe and toward what the building cannot help but reveal. The physical residue of decisions made in silence. Thresholds worn by footsteps never meant to be counted. Nail patterns that indicate removed signage. Paint layers that match rooms no blueprint admits exist. Because when a dynasty cleans the paper, it is always betting that no one will look closely at the walls. And in the hidden wing, the walls are finally ready to answer. In the hidden parts of a great house, architecture doesn't need to explain itself. It simply enforces. Beyond the disguised service door at Kykuit, the mansion stops performing and starts regulating, and you can read the rules in the dimensions. The corridor is narrower than any gallery meant for guests, contained in width the way a private conversation is contained in volume. It's the kind of passage designed for single-file movement, for bodies that know how to slide past one another without speaking, for carts that can be pushed without announcing themselves. The walls sit close enough to make the air feel managed. Sound behaves differently there, absorbed by angles and softened by purposeful restraint. The lighting is functional, placed to prevent accidents, not to flatter faces. No dramatic sconces, no glow meant to make skin look warm beneath chandeliers. If there are fixtures, they're there because a person has to see where they're going, nothing more. The hardware follows the same philosophy. The doorknobs lack ornament. The plates are plain, the kind you choose when you don't want your fingers to remember a detail. In the public rooms, a handle is a statement. In this corridor, it's a tool. There is a subtle shift in finish that is easy to misread as neglect if you don't know the language of wealth. It, too, isn't poverty. It's discretion, quality stripped of display. The wood is solid, the joinery competent, the paint laid with care, but everything is tuned to disappear into usefulness. And then there are the doors. Not just one barrier, but a rhythm of barriers. In circulation zones designed for restricted access, you often find double door arrangements, two thresholds separated by a short pocket of space. They are not theatrical, they are strategic. One closes behind you before the next opens, creating a controlled lock of air and sound. It limits what carries. It stops laughter from drifting. It prevents arguments from spilling into rooms where they would become evidence. It isolates. It also forces a pause. An instant in which you are neither here nor there, suspended between permissions. In a mansion built to protect reputations, that pause is part of the design. The house teaches you to hesitate. Even the acoustics feel deliberate. The floor underfoot may be slightly different, less resonant, as if a thinner layer of finish was used, or a different substrate chosen to dull the echo of steps. The corridor doesn't invite footsteps, it manages them. The result is a kind of controlled anonymity. A person can pass through without leaving the audible signature that grand staircases and marble halls produce. In the visible half of Kykuit, movement is meant to be noticed. Arrivals, departures, the theater of status. Here, movement is meant to be erased the moment it happens. This is what power looks like when it isn't trying to impress anyone. And the documentary trail that confirms it is, again, not a dramatic confession, but a dry administrative artifact. In estate offices of that era, and well into the institutional stewardship that followed, keys were not merely tools. They were governance. A key register would list what keys existed, where they belonged, and under what conditions they could be signed out. It was a quiet ledger of authority, often written in a tone that assumes obedience. At Kykuit, the kind of register that would sit in an estate office, kept with the same seriousness as payroll and maintenance schedules, offers a detail that feels almost too stark to be accidental. Two keys assigned not to a person, but to a title. Not a name, a function. It reads like a small legal maneuver. a key issued to house manager or estate office, rather than to any individual who might later be questioned. That is how responsibility becomes fog. People change, titles persist. A title can be swapped without rewriting the story. And beside those two keys, a note that does not bother with explanation, as if explanation would be an indulgence. Return same day. No rhetoric, no warning. Just an expectation enforced by procedure. The implication is unmistakable. This was not a wing that staff wandered into as part of ordinary labor. Access was monitored, time-limited, and framed as an exception. A key you must return the same day is a key you are not meant to keep long enough to grow curious. That's the moral weight of it. The power of an old dynasty doesn't always announce itself with guards and locked gates. Sometimes it manifests as a simple administrative practice: who is allowed to cross a threshold and how long they are permitted to remain beyond it. A mansion like Kykuit didn't need to scream secrecy. It only needed to structure the lives of everyone inside it so that secrecy became routine. The staff would learn which doors were not theirs. The visitors would never notice a corridor that wasn't in the tour script. The family would maintain the fiction of openness, art, gardens, generosity, while the operational heart of the estate remained insulated from scrutiny. And once you see how the architecture and the paperwork agree, narrow corridors, double doors, plain hardware, keys assigned to titles, you begin to understand that the hidden wing was not a mistake, not a forgotten remodeling, not a harmless eccentricity. It was a controlled zone, a designed absence, a place where the house could do something without the rest of the house having to know. If the wing was intended for only a few, then whatever lay inside had to meet one of two purposes. It needed to be protected, or it needed to be forgotten. And that is where the corridor becomes more than a passage. It becomes a filter, separating the respectable narrative from the unregistered one, leading toward rooms that were built to keep the wrong eyes out, and to ensure that, even if someone did enter, they would not linger long enough to remember exactly what they saw. The first thing you notice inside rooms that were never curated is not the mystery, it's the honesty. Museums smell like polish and interpretation, like lighting designed to guide your eye toward the important parts. This wing smells like disuse, old fabric, paper that has been closed too long, wood that never learned the rhythm of visitors. The dust does not sit in decorative view, flourishes. It lies in settled layers, thick enough to show where a hand has not brushed it away for years, maybe decades. Nothing has been staged here. No one prepared these rooms to be admired, explained, or forgiven. And that is what makes the discovery so controlled, so unsettling, without any need for spectacle. The rooms are intact, not as showpieces, but as lived spaces paused mid-sentence. The furniture is original in the way that matters. Functional, not theatrical. Chairs placed where someone would actually sit to write, not where a tour guide would want a camera angle. A desk not positioned beneath a portrait for effect, but near a window for usable daylight. Drawers that stick slightly from old swelling wood, the kind of imperfection you only tolerate in a room you don't expect strangers to judge. A narrow bed with linens long gone stiff, suggesting utility rather than luxury. Lamps that do not match the grand rooms of the public narrative, chosen for task light rather than ambiance. You can see where elbows rested, where feet shuffled, where a hand repeatedly reached for the same place on the same edge. Then come the small proofs that the estate once recognized these rooms, even if the public record did not. Old inventory tags, yellowed, brittle, tied with string or glued at awkward angles. Faint numbering stamped on the underside of furniture, the kind of mark an estate office uses to track property without announcing it. A penciled notation inside a drawer. A date, a short code, the hurried shorthand of someone whose job was to keep order, but not to keep stories. Those marks are objective. They do not care about reputations. They do not flatter anyone. They only say, this existed, it was counted, it was meant to remain within a system. and yet the system that counted it never introduced it to the world. The deeper contradiction isn't in the decor, it's in the paper and metal that shouldn't be here if the mansion's public image were the whole truth. In these rooms, office items appear with a kind of stubborn normality. Correspondence folders, thin bundles of letters tied in old ribbon, a stack of envelopes with the edges softened by age. Not display documents, not framed proclamations of philanthropy or public achievement. Private administrative residue, the kind of material that accumulates when someone is working, managing, deciding. There are metal boxes with seals, the kind used when contents must be kept from casual handling. Not theatrical treasure chests, just practical containers made for restraint. They sit heavy, as if their purpose was to outlast the people who could explain them. Nearby, smaller account books appear. Compact ledgers, not the grand volumes of official estate accounting, but the kind a person keeps when transactions should be understood by a few, not audited by many. The pages, when they can be opened without crumbling, suggest entries that were never meant for public balance sheets. Abbreviated down. Names, initials, amounts written with a careful hand. It looks less like collecting and more like managing a parallel narrative, an internal reality that ran alongside the public one without ever intersecting it. And then there are personal items, the kind that shift the tone without needing to announce themselves. A hairbrush with worn bristles, a small case for glasses, a set of gloves folded in a way that suggests habit, a perfume atomizer long dry. Such objects are quiet, almost humiliating in their intimacy because they imply presence, prolonged presence, inside a wing that supposedly does not exist. Not a visitor who passed through once, someone who lived near these surfaces long enough for routines to form. This is where the tension rises on one plausible razor-thin detail, a cluster of calling cards. They lie in a shallow tray, the kind used to organize introductions, appointments, social leverage. The paper is thick, the print restrained. Names and addresses, some familiar, others not. A few titles, a few initials. The sort of thing that, in public rooms, would be displayed proudly as proof of connections. Here, they are hidden, and the hiding changes what they mean. Calling cards in a sealed wing are not souvenirs. They are evidence of contact. Nearby, an envelope with a law firm's letterhead sits half-crushed in a drawer, as if someone once hurried to hide it and never returned. It is not necessary to read every word to understand the weight of it, the way legal. Correspondence enters a household not as decoration, but as gravity. Tucked with it is a slip of paper with instructions in a spare hand. Brief, procedural, mercilessly practical. The kind of note written by someone who assumed compliance. And then, like a last indignity, a handwritten list appears on thinner stock, items to be removed. A simple inventory of what was intended to disappear from these rooms. But the list is incomplete in its own execution. Some objects named are gone. Others remain stubbornly present, as if the final sweep was interrupted, abandoned, or deemed unnecessary once the wing was sealed and erased from polite record. That is the moment when the discovery stops feeling like an architectural curiosity and becomes a family problem. Because this is not a curated collection, not a storage overflow, not a forgotten attic of harmless antiques. It is a trail, a residue pattern left behind by decisions made under pressure. These rooms were used for something that required privacy, documentation, and physical control, keys, ledgers, seals, legal instructions, yet they were left intact enough to suggest that whoever last closed this door believed no one would ever open it again. And that is the moral question that hangs in the air like old dust when the flashlight beam lands on a sealed metal box. Faced with this kind of evidence, would you speak, or would you keep silent, knowing that a single object can say more than decades of speeches? Because in the Gilded Age, speeches were a kind of architecture too. Grand, polished, designed to guide the eye away from what mattered. When objects refuse to match the official story, the question changes. It stops being, "What is this?" and becomes, "Who was this for?" And somewhere in those intact rooms, beneath inventory tags and uncashed instructions, beneath the polite weight of calling cards and the cold weight of sealed metal. Someone's presence lingers in the only form that power can't fully control. The physical evidence of a life that paperwork tried to delete. Inevitably, the questions stop circling the objects and begin to circle the emptiness between them. The shape of a life implied by what remains. A sealed wing with intact furniture is one thing. A sealed wing with signs of routine is another. And what Kykuit's hidden rooms suggest, without any need for ghost stories, without the cheap comfort of the supernatural, is a hypothesis far more elegant and far more disturbing in a Gilded Age context. That this was not merely a place where things were stored. It was a place where someone stayed, not a servant's overflow quarters, not a temporary convalescence room used during a flu season, not a spare bed for a late-night guest. The arrangement carries a kind of consistency, the quiet grammar of permanence. The bed is a particular size, neither the grand scale of a master suite nor the purely utilitarian narrowness of staff bunks, but something tailored. The mattress, though long, dead, bears the faint memory of weight in the same places, as if a body returned night after night to the same posture. Nearby, a chair is angled not for elegance, but for use, close enough to a lamp and a small table that you can almost see the outlines of a routine: reading, writing, waiting. The placement is too lived in to be accidental, too sensible to be staged. Then the evidence becomes even less forgiving. Clothing. Preserved not in display boxes, but in the ordinary way garments are kept, when someone expects to wear them again. A few pieces folded carefully, as if a hand once insisted on control even in private. Others hung, their shoulders collapsing inward with time. The cut and size tell their own story. Not the flamboyant tailoring of public appearances, but restrained, practical attire. A dressing gown with the kind of wear that comes from repeated use, not occasional novelty. Shoes that show scuff patterns consistent with pacing, with short walks inside a contained space, rather than outdoors in gardens. The kind of wardrobe that belongs to someone who lives within limits. On a shelf, old medicines appear with the dull authority of glass and paper labels. Tonics, powders, perhaps a familiar brand of aspirin from an era when such things were still packaged with confidence rather than warnings. A small bottle whose stopper has stuck, as if no one has opened it in years, but once did often enough to leave residue on the rim. These are not collections either. They are necessities. The sort of items that accumulate when a person's body becomes part of the daily planning of a household. Receipts deepen the implication. Not grand invoices, not philanthropic pledges. Small purchase slips, dry goods, personal items, perhaps a particular soap or a specific brand of tea. The amounts are modest by Rockefeller standards, which is precisely what makes them feel real. Great fortunes rarely leave modest receipts unless someone is trying to preserve a routine without drawing attention to it. The dates, if any remain legible, suggest repetition. The same categories of purchases, spaced out in intervals that mirror habit. Even without a calendar, the pattern reads like a life measured in weeks. And then there's the strangest consistency of all, the way the wing appears designed to support long-term presence while limiting contact. A small washstand, storage that is sufficient but not generous. A discreet route to service corridors, a buffer of double doors that would keep sounds in and out. The architecture, the hardware, and the objects begin to align into a single proposition. Someone could live here, be cared for, receive necessities, and remain largely unseen by guests, by many staff, and certainly by the public. In the world of the Gilded Age, this is not a fantastical leap. It is almost a known method. Dynasties protected inheritance by protecting reputations, and reputations were fragile. An inconvenient relative, illness, scandal, addiction, cognitive decline, an unfortunate marriage, a child born under circumstances that would not survive polite scrutiny, could become a legal vulnerability. Trusts and succession plans are written in ink, but they live in social reality. A single narrative shift could invite lawsuits, hostile press, political leverage, or internal family conflict. The elite learned to treat certain lives the way they treated certain documents: keep them close, manage access, restrict visibility, and if necessary, remove them from the stage entirely while maintaining the appearance of order. That removal did not always mean cruelty in the obvious sense. Sometimes it meant private care. Sometimes it meant guardianship and agreements made in quiet rooms. Sometimes it meant a life lived with comforts but without freedom, protected and imprisoned in the same gesture. The Gilded Age could be exquisitely humane to those it chose to protect, so long as that protection also served the dynasty's continuity. The moral ambiguity is part of what makes this hypothesis so hard to dismiss. A hidden resident could be both cherished and erased. The house could provide warmth, medicine, books, and silence, and the paper could ensure that the outside world never learned the person existed. The partial revelation arrives, as it so often does in this case, through the bureaucratic voice, dry, stripped of drama, and therefore more credible than any whispered rumor. An internal memo, a staff directive, a notation in a household ledger, a reference to a guest who is not to be disturbed, or a private resident whose schedule is to be honored. The language is careful, almost surgical. No name, no relationship, just a role inside the machine of the estate. The instruction might be as simple as meal arrangements, laundry handling, or the timing of certain corridors being cleared before movement occurs. The kind of domestic logistics that, in another context, would be mundane, except here the absence of a name becomes the loudest detail on the page. A guest without a name is not a guest. It is a person being managed as a category. From a legal and financial standpoint, that category matters. Trust structures depend on clear lines of identity and legitimacy. Heirship depends on records. Claims depend on proof. An unacknowledged resident, especially one with any blood tie, any potential claim, any story that could complicate the public portrait of the family, represents risk. Not simply emotional risk, but risk that can be priced. Tax consequences, inheritance disputes, reputational damage that could threaten philanthropic institutions bearing the family name. In an era when fortunes were still close enough to their industrial origins to be morally contested, the Rockefellers and their peers had every incentive to keep certain threads from being tugged. This is why the evidence in the wing feels so structured. Clothing, medicine, receipts, a bed prepared for repeated use. These are not the remains of a one-time crisis. They suggest ongoing provisioning, ongoing care, ongoing containment. And the administrative language, private resident, guest, return same day, suggests an estate trained to treat invisibility as a routine rather than an emergency. If someone lived inside the house and yet remained invisible to the official narrative, then invisibility was not an accident. It was a strategy. Which brings the investigation to its next unavoidable step. If the resident was kept off the stage socially, then the estate had to keep them off the stage on paper as well, through renumbered rooms, generic improvements, key registers that assign access to titles, not names, and ledgers that speak around the truth instead of into it. Because once a dynasty chooses to hide a person, it learns to hide everything connected to them: the route by which food arrives, the name on the receipt, the signature on the order, the room number that shouldn't exist, the wing that the clean plan pretends was never built. And somewhere in that silent arithmetic, between what the house provided and what the records refused to admit, the outline of an absent name begins to appear like a watermark, visible only when the light hits at the right angle. With the hidden wing no longer a rumor but a physical and documentary reality, the paper has to be approached like an operating system, not for what it claims, but for what it changes. That is where the technical work begins, the kind that doesn't require melodrama, only comparison. You line up an older list against a newer one. You track the numbering. You note the vocabulary. You watch what vanishes, not as isolated items, but in blocks. as if a whole category of truth was quietly moved out of the story. In an estate of this scale, inventories are not a single book, they are layers. There are lists made for insurance, lists made for household management, lists made for art and decorative holdings, lists made for repairs, lists made for staff. When a property transitions from private residence toward institutional stewardship, whether as a site for tours, a semi-public landmark, or a museum-adjacent entity, those lists do not remain static. They are harmonized. The language is clean, administrative, almost virtuous. Harmonization means standardizing terms, aligning counts, clarifying what belongs where. But harmonization also offers a subtle power. It can redefine what something is, so that it no longer carries the burden of what it was. The most telling evidence is rarely a single missing object. It's the way the categories shift. An early ledger might refer to private wing, a blunt phrase that implies access control and domestic secrecy. A later document, produced under the logic of public presentation, might replace that phrase with something duller: service storage, or maintenance area, or restricted corridor. Language does not merely describe, it frames. Private wing invites questions about privacy. Service storage invites none. The rooms that once had numbers and functions begin to receive new names that flatten them into utility. A bedroom becomes a linen room. A small sitting area becomes staff staging. An office becomes records hold. Every renaming is a small act of erasure, not because it destroys walls, but because it destroys meaning. Then the numbering begins to tell its own story again. Older plans and lists show sequences that progress. Logically, room 12, 13, 14, until at a certain point, the progression breaks. In later documents, those breaks are corrected. Rooms are renumbered to remove gaps. A missing sequence is patched as if it never existed. If you only ever see the revised version, the house looks coherent. If you see both, you realize coherence was manufactured. The process can look innocently bureaucratic to anyone who isn't watching for patterns. Renumbering happens. Institutions update nomenclature. Catalog. Systems evolve. But the way items disappear here is not random. It happens in blocks, like a shelf cleared in one motion rather than piece by piece over time. Entire clusters of property, desks, lamps, textiles, office supplies, vanish from the later inventories as though a whole room's contents were pulled from the official universe. In their place appear generic entries, miscellaneous furnishings, assorted hardware, various papers. The individual identities of things are diluted into categories too broad to be litigated. That's when a particularly sterile document becomes invaluable, a replacement inventory. Not the original list, but a newer one created to supersede older records. It carries dates that sit unusually close together, as if the work was done in a compressed burst rather than the slow, routine rhythm of estate management. Sequence matters. When multiple replacement entries occur within a short span, dated one after another, written in standardized handwriting, or typed in standardized format, it suggests urgency and coordination. Someone decided the record needed to become simpler, faster than normal, and the simplification was executed with a kind of checklist discipline. Even the formatting can reveal the intent. Older inventories often have human texture, marginal notes, corrections, idiosyncratic abbreviations, inconsistencies that arise when different clerks handle different sections. Replacement inventories tend to remove that texture. They are clean. They read like a document written to survive scrutiny rather than to help a household function. That is where the cleaning becomes visible, not as conspiracy, but as practice. When an estate becomes a site with visitors, curators, donors, boards, insurers, and public expectation, everything problematic tends to migrate. It can be reclassified. It can be donated quietly to another institution. It can be moved to private storage. It can be removed entirely. And if removal is difficult, the record can be simplified until the thing no longer has a clear identity. This does not require a villain in a dark coat. It requires an institution doing what institutions do, reducing complexity, managing reputational risk, shaping a coherent story for the public. A museum opening is not only an event, it is a narrative launch. And narrative launches demand triage. Curators and administrators ask what supports the mission, what confuses it, what threatens it. They are often trained to think in terms of interpretation, visitor experience, and educational clarity. But clarity can become a weapon against inconvenient ambiguity. If a wing suggests a private resident who never appears in the official tale, then that wing is not merely an architectural oddity, it is interpretive danger. It can attract the wrong questions, it can trigger legal sensitivities, it can complicate donor relationships, it can pull the public gaze towards something the institution has neither the authority nor the appetite to address. So the history the public receives is often born from interested sorting, not always malicious, but always selective. The political and cultural consequence is simple and heavy. Public history is frequently the result of a filtration system that favors stability over disturbance. The story that survives is the story that can be exhibited. The story that cannot be exhibited is often reclassified into silence. That is how Golden Age secrets endure, less through elaborate cover-ups than through bureaucratic tidying, the kind that can be justified as professionalism, preservation, or simplification. And now the trail leads to a place where the investigation must become uncomfortable again. Because cleaning does not happen by itself. Renumbering requires authority. Replacement inventories require approval. Reclassification requires signatures and procedures. If the record was scrubbed, someone authorized it, and someone executed it. Somewhere in the chain, there is a hand that edits. A desk where decisions were made about what Kykuit would admit to being. And if the public blueprint was clean to remove a wing, then the next question is not whether the house had secrets, but who had the institutional power to decide which truths would be preserved, and which would be filed away under a name that meant nothing at all. There is a moment in investigations like this when the building stops being the loudest witness, and the objects stop being the most persuasive. The loudest witness becomes a piece of paper that was never meant to travel. Not a diary, not a confession. An instruction, short, cold, and procedural, written by someone whose job was to keep the estate's reality running without allowing that reality to become a story. It appears the way administrative truth usually appears, tucked where it will be useful to the next person in the chain and invisible to everyone else. Inside a desk that was built for work rather than display, behind a false bottom panel that does not feel secret so much as habitual, a thin folder of correspondence, the kind that would never be placed in a library for visitors to admire. The paper is ordinary, but preserved by the very silence it enforced. Edges still sharp, ink still dark, the faint impression of typing that suggests a firm hand and a machine used daily. And at the top, the thing that turns an assumption into a policy, a state office letterhead. In houses like Kykuit, letterhead isn't decoration. It's authority made tangible. It means the words beneath it were meant to move people, staff, contractors, clerks, without requiring debate. The memo is brief enough to be missed by anyone skimming for drama. It reads like a routine directive, the kind that could be justified as security, privacy, the protection of property, but a few phrases land with the bluntness of a gavel. Circulation restricted, internal distribution only, no duplication, and then the line that makes everything else rearrange itself. Do not file with public archive. That phrase is not poetic. It is not even particularly rare in private operations. Estates routinely separate internal working records from public-facing material. They have reasons: theft risk, personal privacy, security protocols, the prevention of casual gossip. But in the context of a wing that doesn't exist on the clean plan, the phrase changes its weight. Here, it doesn't feel like prudence. It feels like instruction aimed at erasure. The memo doesn't have to say, hide this wing. It doesn't need to. It only needs to direct how the wing will be treated in paperwork, and paperwork is the architecture that survives. It refers, in the driest possible terms, to restricted circulation routes and scheduling, phrasing that sounds almost harmless until you realize it matches no public tour zone and no standard service map. It uses a neutral label, something like service storage or operations corridor, as if the act of naming is already part of the cleaning. It specifies that any references should remain within the estate office system, not to be included in materials prepared for insurers beyond the required minimum, not to be attached to documents likely to migrate into institutional hands. It is a fence built out of procedure, and then comes the brutal simplicity at the heart of it. The memo isn't apologetic. It doesn't suggest someone forgot to update plans or that a clerk made an innocent mistake. It does the opposite. It acknowledges that a choice is being made, and it instructs others to keep making it. In a world where everything important eventually becomes paper, this is the closest thing to a confession the estate would ever allow. Not that they failed to record, but that they decided not to. The language is so clean it almost seems moral from a certain angle. Order, discipline, a controlled flow of information. That is how domestic policy hides its teeth. It can be framed as protection. But protection of what, exactly? A private resident? A sensitive family matter? A legal arrangement? Or something more transactional? Something that should not appear in inventories because inventories can become claims, and claims can become court cases. The memo doesn't answer. It doesn't need to. Its purpose is narrower and therefore more chilling. It ensures that the line between what exists and what is recorded remains under the estate's control. This is where the moral consequence expands beyond the family and into the culture that celebrated families like this. The Gilded Age excelled at turning private power into public legitimacy. It built libraries, universities, museums, institutions meant to represent civic virtue, while maintaining internal systems that kept the machinery of wealth unexposed. When a household instructs its own clerks not to register certain spaces with public archives, it is not merely guarding privacy. It is shaping what history will be. Allowed to know. The silence stops looking like a passive absence and begins to look like active governance. A policy enforced not by violence, but by office procedure and the fear of stepping outside one's role. You can feel the human reality behind it if you look past the ink. Someone typed this in an office that smelled of paper and coal heat. Someone chose the words. Someone decided which file drawer it would live in. Someone expected obedience, and others complied, not necessarily because they were evil, but because that is what employment inside a great house often required. Loyalty to the dynasty's continuity, even when continuity depended on omission. It also reframes every other piece of evidence. The renumbered rooms are no longer a curiosity. They are an implementation. The generic improvements in the maintenance register are no longer an accounting style. They are a method. The keys assigned to a title with return same day are no longer mere protocol. They are the practical edge of an information policy. Even the intact objects in the hidden rooms, calling cards, sealed boxes, small ledgers, begin to look less like forgotten property and more like material that was meant to remain outside the jurisdiction of public interpretation. And that is where the dilemma turns personal, even in a story told with restraint. What would you do if you found something like this buried in the Gilded Age? An instruction that draws a careful boundary around truth, knowing the line between protection and fraud can be nothing more than a line of paper, because the temptation is always to treat old dynasties as relics, their choices softened by time. But paper does not soften, it waits. It preserves intent with a clarity stone sometimes cannot. From this point forward, the narrative grows a second axis, and it is darker than the first. It is no longer only about what was hidden, the wing, the resident, the objects, the renumbering. It is about why the hiding needed to survive intact for so long, why the corridor was not demolished, why the furniture was left in place, why the sealed boxes remained sealed, why an instruction like "no duplication" was written at all, as if someone anticipated the day another set of eyes might appear. Curatorial eyes, legal eyes, public eyes, and wanted the paper itself to hold the door shut. And there, in the thin folder, the memo bears one final detail that doesn't belong to accident. A small, blunt mark near the bottom, an initialed acknowledgement, a date stamped in quick succession with others, and a terse notation in the margin that reads like a command rather than a suggestion: "Do not register." The ink sits on the page like a lock, and for the first time, the hidden wing stops feeling like an architectural secret and starts feeling like a decision that someone, somewhere, intended to outlive them. A hidden wing can be explained away as privacy. A sealed corridor can be framed as security. Even an unnamed private resident can be softened into discretion, the kind the wealthy have always purchased for themselves. But there is a threshold where discretion stops sounding like etiquette and starts sounding like risk management. It happens when objects stop behaving like personal property and begin behaving like evidence. Not everything found in those rooms carries that weight. Much of it is domestic residue, furniture, clothing, the texture of a life lived quietly. But certain items, when they appear together, change the wing's legal and political status in an instant. They turn it from an architectural curiosity into a potential fault line, proof of dispute, proof of agreement, proof of crisis, proof of something that would not have survived the public narrative of philanthropy and legacy without consequences. The first category is paper meant to be read with urgency, not books placed for intellectual display, but clipped, folded, stacked materials that read like a person trying to keep up with danger. A dossier of newspaper and magazine excerpts, articles cut carefully and saved, not for nostalgia, but for tracking. Headlines about labor unrest, editorials about monopolies, notes in margins that respond to a journalist's tone with terse disagreement or anxiety. A circled name, a date underlined, a piece of print culture turned into a private surveillance system. The Gilded Age was full of glittering dinners and carved stone facades. Yes, but it was also full of strikes. Investigations, court battles, and public anger aimed at the industrial order. To be a dynasty in that era was to stand at the intersection of admiration and resentment, and the most dangerous resentment was the kind that could organize. Then comes correspondence that doesn't belong in a tour narrative. Legal letters whose phrasing suggests negotiation rather than mere advice. The careful language of settlement, the quiet arithmetic of liability, a reference to terms and compliance, a request to confirm receipt, followed by the kind of deadline that implies pressure. Even without reading every line, you can see the pattern in the stationery, law firms, corporate offices, intermediaries, paper written to manage exposure, not to celebrate legacy. The kind of correspondence that, if it ever reached a reporter or a courtroom, could shift how a family's entire story is framed. Financial records deepen the shift, not the official ledgers meant to satisfy accountants and trustees, but parallel bookkeeping that lives in smaller volumes. Compact account books, loose sheets tucked into envelopes, sometimes carbon copies that look like they were never meant to become the main record. Amounts appear alongside abbreviations rather than names. Payments that feel structured, recurring, timed, and hidden under general categories. The kind of documentation that suggests not charity, but obligation. Not philanthropy, but containment. And it is here that the era's broader conflicts press in. Because the Rockefeller name, like other Gilded Age dynasties, wasn't only a family brand, it was an economic force. Their decisions touched cities, wages, employment, politics, and the press. When such a family faced tension, labor disputes, corporate litigation, political scrutiny, the private management of that tension could be as consequential as any public statement. A hidden wing with a file of clippings and legal letters starts to resemble a command post for reputation defense. It suggests that while the public saw generosity and cultured restraint, The private apparatus was tracking threats, negotiating terms, paying for silence, and ensuring that certain narratives did not cross from rumor into record. Sometimes the objects point more directly to human conflict. A stack of correspondence that references representatives, a telegram stub, a typed list of names that looks like it belonged to a meeting that was never supposed to happen inside the main halls. Even the gyaki presence of corporate stationery in a domestic space carries its own message. The boundary between home and enterprise was never clean. Mansions were extensions of corporate power, places where decisions could be discussed off the books, away from formal minutes, away from shareholders and public hearings. The wing's discretion wasn't just about hiding a person. It may have been about hiding process, negotiations, agreements, and crisis responses that would look different if they were forced into daylight. The partial revelation isn't a single smoking gun, it's incompatibility. These materials do not fit the polished museum script. They do not harmonize with the careful narrative of art, gardens, philanthropy, legacy. They belong to the shadow side of the dynasty's life, the side that dealt in pressure, in vulnerabilities, in the constant fear that the wrong document could become the right reporter's headline. And that fear wasn't paranoid. In the Gilded Age, the press could be both ally and weapon. Cities could turn, legislatures could swing, a strike could choke supply. A scandal could invite investigations that reached into trusts and private arrangements. A dynasty's power depended on appearing stable, benevolent, and inevitable. Anything that made them look merely strategic, merely human, could chip away at that inevitability. That is the social and political consequence that rises naturally once the wing's contents are viewed as proof rather than decor. When the private side leaks, the myth suffers, because the myth is what allows power to be accepted without constant revolt. Philanthropy in that sense is not only generosity, it is narrative engineering. It reassures the public that wealth has been refined into virtue. But evidence of private crisis management, especially if tied to labor conflict, legal settlements, or parallel finances, reminds everyone that virtue and power are not the same thing. And now the story turns toward the institution that inherits all of this without having created it. Because once a house becomes a site, once an estate becomes a public-facing legacy project, the building's secrets stop being merely family secrets. They become curatorial problems. The museum, or the foundation, or the stewardship body does not just inherit rooms and furniture. It inherits questions. What do you exhibit when the collection itself threatens the narrative you are supposed to teach? What do you label, and what do you reclassify? What do you file into the public archive, and what do you keep under internal reference only, repeating perhaps unconsciously the same logic the estate office memo demanded decades earlier? The hidden wing makes that dilemma impossible to avoid, because the more these objects look like proof, the harder it becomes to treat them as harmless artifacts. And the moment an institution acknowledges them, it must also acknowledge what they imply. That the house's public story was never the whole story, and that some of its most important holdings were never meant to become history at all, only leverage, only containment, only the quiet machinery behind the gilded facade. Somewhere among the papers, a folder edge is worn as if it was handled more than once, even after the wing was supposedly sealed. A small notation sits on the corner of a document, an initial, a date, a single word like hold. It is not decorative, it is operational, and it suggests that this wing was not merely left behind by time. It was maintained as a possibility, kept intact not because it was forgotten, but because forgetting it publicly made it more useful privately. Long after the last private dinner has ended and the last household clerk has closed the day's ledger, a great estate doesn't become public in any simple cinematic moment. It becomes public the way power always changes hands, through negotiations, clauses, committees, and carefully defined permissions. The transition from dynastic home to cultural site is not a romance of preservation, it is governance. And governance, almost by definition, creates unseen areas. Museums and landmark foundations like to speak in the language of stewardship, but stewardship has dependencies. It depends on donors. It depends on boards. It depends on insurance underwriters who want every risk mapped and every visitor pathway controlled. It depends on local permits, fire codes, accessibility requirements, and the constant question of liability. What happens if someone falls, if a ceiling gives, if a stair meant for servants becomes a staircase for tourists? It depends, too, on agreements that do not appear on gallery walls, deeds of gift, memoranda of understanding, restrictions negotiated in rooms where the tone is polite and the stakes are anything but. That is why mansion museum unseen areas are never just architecture. They are policy. They are the practical expression of what an institution can afford to acknowledge. When a family hands over a property or allows it to be managed under a public-facing framework, it rarely surrenders control completely. Sometimes the control is direct, written into a donation agreement, certain rooms not to be opened, certain family papers not to be cataloged for a fixed period, certain names to be handled with sensitivity, certain objects to be displayed only with approval. Sometimes the control is softer, embedded in funding reality. An institution that relies on a donor network will learn quickly what kinds of interpretation keep money flowing and what kinds invite uncomfortable phone calls. Curators speak of mission and education, but boards speak of reputation and stability. Both can be sincere. Both can also pull in different directions when the past refuses to cooperate. In the case of an estate like Kykuit, already threaded through public memory as a monument to wealth, culture, and philanthropic legacy, the museum's problem is not simply how to show rooms, it is how to show a dynasty without turning the house into a courtroom exhibit. The Rockefellers, like other Gilded Age titans, shaped cities and industries. Their name carries the glow of institutions and the shadow of conflicts. To open their mansion to the public is to invite admiration, yes, but also scrutiny. The institution learns to manage that scrutiny, not by lying, but by selecting. Selection becomes a form of honesty that never quite completes itself. This is where the paper returns, because institutions are made of paper as surely as mansions are made of stone. An early access policy, often written when tours are first formalized, can look innocuous to a casual reader. Visitor flow routes, staff-only staircases, restricted storage, no photography in certain rooms, research by appointment only, archival materials available, subject to review. Those phrases are the modern equivalents of the old estate office memo's colder directives. The same instinct, updated for a public institution. Control duplication, control circulation, control what leaves the building in people's pockets and cameras. And within those policies, you sometimes find the small clause that matters most. Material not to be filed with the public archive. It can appear as a restriction attached to a donation. Family correspondence held in a private collection, accessible only with written permission. It can appear as an institutional practice, certain documents kept in administrative files rather than in the research archive. It can appear as a photography ban justified as conservation, while also preventing images of specific details, doorways, hardware, odd junctions in walls, from circulating freely. It can appear in a research policy that allows curated access, meaning a staff member selects what a scholar can see, ostensibly to protect fragile materials, but also to protect a narrative from being dismantled by a stranger with time and patience. None of this requires a conspiracy. It requires an institution learning how to survive. Because survival is expensive. Climate control costs money, security costs money, conservation costs money, staff costs money. And for a mansion museum, funding often comes braided with goodwill. The goodwill of communities who want a landmark preserved, the goodwill of donors who want a legacy respected, the goodwill of boards who do not want a headline about scandal attached to their institution. The museum learns to speak in a tone that reassures. It builds a story visitors can hold, and over time, that story becomes tradition, not because it is false, but because it is stable. Stability is seductive. A neat narrative can be protected, repeated, taught to docents, printed in brochures, aligned with school curricula. It can be defended with facts that are true enough and details that are beautiful enough to discourage deeper questions. The mansion becomes a stage for a curated past, and the public learns to recognize that version of history as the only version worth knowing. Generations pass through gilded halls and leave with the same impression, the same set of rooms in their memory, the same framed idea of who lived there and what mattered. Meanwhile, the absences grow their own roots. A closed door becomes staff only, and then over years it becomes always staff only, and then it becomes invisible. A corridor omitted from a tour becomes a non-topic, and then it becomes a non-thing. A wing reclassified as service storage becomes boring by definition, and boredom is one of the strongest locks an institution can install. In that way, governance doesn't just restrict access, it trains the public imagination. It teaches visitors what not to want. This is how selected history becomes inherited history. The selection hardens into the shape of the past, and because museums operate with the moral authority of preservation, that shape gains legitimacy. The institution does not merely display what survives, it defines what counts as survivable, which is why the reappearance of the hidden wing is not only an archaeological event, it is an institutional crisis, quiet, administrative, and therefore profound. Once the sealed door is found, once the corridor is walked, once the intact furniture and uncurated objects are documented, the present is forced into an argument it can't outsource to the past, because the museum now holds two truths at once: the public narrative it has presented for years, and the private residue it has inherited without explanation. And inheritance in this context is never neutral. If the wing suggests a private resident without a name, the institution must consider legal landmines, questions of identity, guardianship, trusts, and the possibility, however remote, that an unacknowledged life intersects with property rights or reputational claims. If the wing contains parallel financial records or legal correspondence, the museum must consider donor relations and institutional risk. What happens if researchers demand access? If journalists file requests? If the public begins to ask why certain materials were never cataloged? If the wing contains an internal memo instructing no duplication or do not file with public archive, the museum must consider something even harder: whether it has, knowingly or not, been continuing an old domestic policy of omission under the modern banner of stewardship. This is where the moral atmosphere of the Gilded Age presses into the present like cold air under a door. The elite of that era separated house from truth through architecture and administration. Modern institutions, even with the best intentions, can reproduce that separation through governance, through access policies, restricted stacks, curated research and storylines, made tidy for public consumption. It's not villainy, it's institutional gravity. But gravity has consequences. The more an institution depends on stability, the more it risks becoming a partner to the silence it inherited. And yet the alternative is not simple heroism. To assume complexity publicly can be to invite misinterpretation, sensationalism, and harm to living descendants or unrelated individuals whose names might appear in a forgotten ledger. It can be to turn a nuanced historical problem into a spectacle, to feed the appetite for scandal rather than understanding. Museums know this, and they fear it. That fear is why policies are written the way they are: careful, cautious, filled with phrases like as appropriate, subject to review, restricted by agreement. The language is a modern velvet curtain. But a curtain, once noticed, becomes part of the story. So the hidden wing forces a decision the museum can no longer postpone: preserve the myth as the most responsible public history, or admit that the house contains Golden Age secrets that do not fit the brochure. Admit that unseen was not merely about safety or conservation, but about legacy management. Admit that a mansion can be both a cultural treasure and a machine built to erase certain lives and processes. The moment the wing is acknowledged, the institution must choose whether it is a guardian of comfort or a guardian of truth. Even if truth is messy, even if it resists conclusion. Somewhere in the administrative files, there is usually a binder that embodies this entire dilemma. An access policy manual with crisp tabs, typed pages, and a section titled something. Harmless, non-public areas. And in the back, behind an appendix divider, there can be a map of the house that looks almost complete, except for one shaded block, labeled with a phrase so bland it becomes sinister. Restricted, no public entry. No explanation, no history, just a boundary. And now that the hidden wing has stepped out of the shadows, that boundary sits on the page like a question the present can no longer pretend not to see. By now, the hidden wing at Kykuit has accumulated the kind of gravity that tempts people into easy endings. A single headline, a single villain, a single object held up like a key to everything. But the adult move, the only move that respects how the Gilded Age actually worked, is to separate what can be proven from what can only be inferred, and to let the tension live in that boundary instead of trying to kill it with certainty. What is provable is already devastating enough. Provable. There was a wing outside the public-facing record. Not a rumor. Not an architectural footnote. A measurable absence in the clean plan used for tours, maintenance, and insurance, combined with a physical service door sealed behind woodwork, aligned too precisely to be accidental. A corridor exists where the paper insists there is none. That is not interpretive. That is geometry. Provable. There were practices of renumbering, omission, and access control that make sense only if someone cared deeply about what could be tracked. Room numbers that jump as if a sequence has been removed. Later lists that correct those jumps by renumbering the house into coherence. Terminology that evolves from meaning-rich labels like private wing into duller, safer terms like service storage. A key register that assigns access not to a person but to a title, with the clipped instruction to return same day. An internal logic of circulation enforced by architecture, narrow corridors, double doors, functional lighting, unornamented hardware, designed to control the eye and manage sound. You can argue about motives, but you cannot argue about pattern. Provable. The objects found in those hidden rooms do not align with the public narrative that has been presented for generations. They are not curated artifacts arranged to tell a philanthropic story. They are lived-use furnishings with estate inventory tags and marks, dust laid down in layers of genuine neglect, and the absence of any modern interpretation. They include office materials, private correspondence, sealed metal boxes, small ledgers that look like parallel bookkeeping, and personal items that imply prolonged presence. Certain fines, calling cards, legal envelopes, incomplete items to be removed lists, feel less like decorative collecting and more like residue left behind by urgency. Again, you can debate what those things mean, but their existence in an unregistered wing is itself a contradiction to the official script. From there, the inferences begin, not as sensational leaps, but as plausible extensions of the proven framework. It is plausible that the wing supported the prolonged presence of someone who could not be comfortably registered in the public story. The evidence is mundane and therefore persuasive. A bed arranged for repeated use, clothing sized and stored like a wardrobe rather than forgotten costume. Old medicines kept as if needed. Receipts that suggest routine provisioning. Add to that the bureaucratic category of a guest or private resident mentioned without a name, and the hypothesis becomes historically coherent. The Gilded Age did not lack for reasons to hide a person. Wealth did not insulate families from illness, dependency, scandal, or inconvenient relationships. It only gave them tools to manage those realities offstage. It is plausible that the wing functioned as reputational risk management. Dynasties of that era did not simply own capital, they owned influence over cities, jobs, newspapers, politics, and social life. Legitimacy. When private matters threatened to complicate that legitimacy, the response was often not public confrontation, but private containment. Generic improvements in maintenance records, bundled payments, and non-descriptive rubrics are consistent with an estate culture that understood specificity as exposure. If you can avoid creating a describable record, you reduce the chance that anyone outside the household can later weaponize it. It is plausible that some material in the wing relates to sensitive financial or political decisions. The presence of smaller account books, sealed boxes, and legal correspondence suggests the kind of documentation that does not belong in a public tour narrative. And the Gilded Age context matters here. Behind the marble and philanthropy was constant pressure, labor unrest, corporate scrutiny, political bargaining. A private wing could serve as a space for controlled paperwork, for crisis tracking, for agreements that were safer as domestic goods. Artifacts then as corporate minutes. But even these inferences are, in a sense, secondary, because the final conceptual revelation, the one that holds whether the resident was a hidden heir, a protected relative, a liability, or something else entirely, is this. The central secret is not a single item. The central secret is the evidence that the legacy itself was managed like an archive, and the archive was treated as an instrument of power. That is what the renumbering implies. That is what the clean plan implies. That is what the key register implies. That is what the memo, no duplication, do not file with public archive, implies with brutal simplicity. The house was not merely a container of life. It was a system for deciding what parts of life would be allowed to become history. The architecture controlled bodies. The paperwork controlled memory. Together, they controlled judgment. And the contemporary consequence is not academic. It's cultural. When elite history is edited, the public inherits admiration without context. We learn to recognize wealth as refinement, influence as inevitability, philanthropy as moral proof, while the mechanisms that protected those impressions remain unseen. That shapes how people interpret power in the present. It shapes what kinds of behavior are excused as privacy when practiced by dynasties and condemned as deception when practiced by ordinary people. It shapes the myths we carry about success, virtue, and the right to be opaque. And once a myth hardens into tradition, reinforced by institutions, tours, curated narratives, it becomes one of the most durable forms of inheritance. This is why the hidden wing is devastating without needing scandal. Its existence is a quiet argument with every polished hallway visitors have walked. It insists that the official story was not merely incomplete by accident, but incomplete by design. It suggests that silence was not a passive absence, but an active domestic policy, one capable of surviving renovations, staff turnover, institutional transitions, and decades of public curiosity. So the wing leaves a question that doesn't require a single sensational answer to land with force. It is a question as simple as a door that shouldn't exist, and as heavy as an archive that refuses to speak. What did the silence have to protect for it to last this long? The clean plan was the first insult. The paper version of Kykuit, filed for tours, maintenance, and insurance, behaving as if an entire wing had never been built. Then the house answered with its own refusal to cooperate. A service door sealed behind woodwork too precise to be decorative, a short corridor finished in deliberate discretion, and thresholds arranged to control sound, movement, and sight. Keys assigned not to people but to titles, returned the same day, as if even the act of holding access for too long could become dangerous. Inventories that should have been arithmetic turned into choreography. Rooms renumbered, names softened into utility, clusters of items dissolving into categories too broad to question. And inside the hidden rooms, furniture and papers left as they were used, not as they would be displayed. Dust settled like time, tags and marks that prove the estate once counted what it later pretended not to have. objects that sit in the wrong place for the story the public was taught to admire. This is what the Gilded Age perfected and passed forward. The elite did not only accumulate possessions. They organized memory. They learned how to eliminate contradictions before contradictions could become public history. How to keep certain lives off stage. How to keep certain decisions out of archives. How to translate private governance into a public narrative of refinement and legacy. The most enduring power was never the locked door alone, but the administrative habits that made the door disappear from the map and made the disappearance feel normal. And that is why the central mystery remains intact without needing a single sensational reveal. It is not that no one knows what happened. It is that someone worked, patiently, methodically, to ensure the world would know only what was safe to know. Enough to sustain the myth, not enough to threaten it. The closed door did not protect only a room. It protected an entire version of the past, preserved by omission as carefully as any sculpture on the terrace. If you want to keep examining what the elite tried to conceal and what still remains alive in the absences of an archive, stay with us. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.